All right, hello everyone. We are back for another Malazan discussion. I am joined by my friend AP Canavan. How are you, AP?
I am doing very well, Philip. It's great to be here again. I like being on your channel and annoying all of your subscribers.
Well, I'm always happy for you to annoy them. So, and I suspect that they are too. So, we are here actually today to do another Malazan poem, and one that I'm particularly interested in because I think tonally it's different from any of the others we've done. I think that The Coming Storm by Refer. Do we know who Refer is, by the way? I don't think so. There's no other reference to Refer anywhere, is there? I
I
was gonna
will refer you to my sigh.
I was gonna do one based on reefer, but I thought that would be less appropriate. So,
Well,
but
we'd have to call a referee.
yeah, or have a referendum. Uh, so, oh dear, I'm sorry, everyone. We didn't plan that. It just comes out sometimes, you know. So, anyway, we are going to be doing a reading of The Coming Storm by, and I can't say it with a straight face anymore, but that poet that you've never heard of anywhere else in the Malazan world that we know of, and it is totally different. I mean, most of the Erickson poems I feel like are very placid, at least on the surface, that there is an understated quality to a lot of his poems, that there's a lot of emotion beneath that surface, but at least on the surface, there seem fairly calm. But this poem is apocalyptic. This poem is absolutely full of some really scary imagery and some just kind of uh, pretty, explosive. I feel like this is a very interesting poem, and so we're gonna see what we make of this one. And as always, we welcome comments and interpretations from our viewers. So we'd love to hear what you guys think of this poem as well. So, Dr. Canavan, if you don't mind, would you please put the poem up on the screen? And there it is. Okay. So I guess I'll read it and then we will break it down. Crawl down, son, this is not your time. Black waves slide under the sheathed moon. Upon the shore, a silent storm, a will untamed, heaves up from the red skirled foam. Scud to your mountain nests, you iron clouds, to leave the sea its dancing refuse of stars. On this host of salty midnight tides, gather drawn and swell tight your tempest. Lift like scaled heads from the blind depths, all your effulgent might in restless roving eyes. Reel back, you tottering forest, this night. The black waves crash on the black shore to steal the flesh from your bony roots. Death comes, shouldering aside in cold legion, in a marching wind, this dread, this blood, this reaper's gale. Wow, that is some really cool stuff there. I almost felt like I was reading Old English poetry. There's some great alliteration in there, and there's some really just powerful imagery, which we're going to go through here. Just really great stuff. But you'll notice, of course, the allusions to the titles there. Midnight Tides appears, which is the book that is most closely related to Reaper's Gale. And of course, Reaper's Gale at the very end. So for Malazan fans, those are definite flags that we'll probably discuss. But I guess let's start at the beginning, AP. Do you want to offer your take on the first couple lines there?
Well, one of the things, there's an interesting progression in this poem. And obviously, how you read it is the way that you read it and your interpretation, you add your spin on it. I would have read it slightly differently, but we end up in the same point because I would start with, because it's crawl down, son. So it's crawl, black waves slide, a silent storm.
Mm-hmm.
Then it goes to heaves and scud,
Yeah.
dancing. So all of this movement, but none of the movement thus far has been particularly violent. But
Mm-hmm.
it's when we get to this sort of turning point here with gather drawn and swell tight your tempest. We go then with scaled heads, blind depths, effulgent might,
Mm,
restless roving,
yeah.
tottering forests, black waves crash, steel flesh, bone. You can see the language
Yeah.
shifts and
Yeah.
becomes more powerful and becomes more violent and becomes more emotive as we get to the end. So it's that starting almost, do not go gently. It's starting gently,
Yeah.
and then it builds and builds and builds. This is an oncoming storm. This is a progression that is going to get more and more violent until we end with the Reaper's Gale,
Mm,
death's wind, death's breath,
yeah.
racing across in a storm, harvesting souls.
The Grim
That's the
Reaper.
Reaper's Gale.
Yeah, yeah, the Grim Reaper. Nice. Yeah, I like that, and I just kind of bowled into it, but I could see where you would definitely want to start a little more calmly. Yeah, that would be a nice way to read it too. Absolutely. But just thinking about crawl down sun. This is not a when you think of the sun setting and you think of beautiful imagery and the sunset and that, we don't usually use words like crawl, right? Crawl has a creepier kind of connotation to it, doesn't it? And this is not your time, right? This is not something that is for bright, sunshiny daytime. We're talking about something a little more serious here, right? This is a little more grim where we're going. So we're telling the sun, get lost. This is this is going to be something a little more dark. So black waves slide. And look at all that great alliteration in there. Black waves slide under the sheathed moon. So the moon also is not illuminating the landscape because it's sheathed, right? It's put away. We can't see the brightness that we normally would see. So the waves are described as black because it's dark, right? We can't see. But there's also, I think, a kind of a threatening intonation there, a sense of vastness, right? That we are surrounded by this darkness. So while you're absolutely right, I think that it's a bit calmer in tone. There is a threat, as you said. There's an impending threat that is coming in the choice of words here. So great stuff. You want to add anything to that before we move on?
Yeah. So I think that the perfect thing that you highlighted there that I think is really, really important is the lack of light in this poem.
Yeah.
So it starts with the sun is there and the sun is now dipping, the sun is disappearing, it is becoming nighttime. So it's
Yeah.
that it's a nice way of saying the sun, a different way of saying the sun set
Right.
or the sun slowly set. You know, it's nice when someone takes the time to come up with a different way of doing it. And yeah, you're exactly right. Crawling has a negative connotation to it
Mm-hmm.
because we could use crawling and you talk about a baby crawling and you have a positive connotation. But in this sense, this crawling, it's an order to the sun to go away. There's a sense of an order being imposed on it, and the sun almost slinking off in defeat, crawling away because there's a greater power coming, and it's this impending threat of night. And then you go, oh, but nighttime, it can be illuminated. We can still have that wonderful silver glow from the moon, which when the moon hits your eye like a big pizza pie, you know, that's amore. But
Yeah.
here, the moon has been sheathed. And so turning the moon, what is sheathed? A weapon. So even in this,
Yeah.
the moon, we get rid of the light of the moon with sheathed moon.
Right.
But there's also that very subtle connotation of violence, hidden violence, because weapons in sheaths get unsheathed.
Yeah.
And that's what I meant about that sort of portentous nature being very subtly woven in here. And
Yeah.
when you think the black waves slide, this
Mm.
is a gliding motion. They are easing in. And when I don't know if you've ever had the opportunity to look out over the sea at night,
Oh yeah.
where you have very, very little light and you get these tiny little crests sometimes where a bit of starlight is reflected off or there's a bit of white spume and foam. But it's this inky blackness.
Yeah.
And when the night sky is very, very dark and the sea is very, very dark, it's almost like you're in a frightening abyss.
Yeah.
And so the black waves slide, that easy motion, that disturbingly easy motion
Yeah.
of this. It's oncoming. The tide is coming. It is going to, they will not stop. Canute learned this lesson.
The hard way.
The tide waits for no man. How many different idioms do we need?
Yeah.
And then upon the shore, a silent storm, a will untamed heaves up. So here we can feel that initial rising of the action.
Yeah.
From the red skirled foam.
Yeah.
What turns foam red?
Blood.
And so again, we can talk about different elements of light entering in the poem, but the fact that the two major colors that we have here are black and red, and it's red foam. This is not a happy poem, as you pointed out.
No, yeah. No unicorns and rainbows here. But go ahead.
I was going to say, we ease back into that, again, slightly easier, softer language. So it's this forward momentum, and it then eases back because it's scud to your mountain nests.
Yeah.
And this iron clouds. So again, sheathing the moon, iron clouds, we're getting that subtle idea of weaponry, of danger. But scud to your mountain nests, the idea, that beautiful picture of the mountain sitting there and the all of the clouds clustered around it like a halo and a nest on the top of the mountain. It's quite poetic. It's quite beautiful.
Yes.
But it's very far removed. It's not nearby.
Exactly.
So, and then that leads us with this. What light are we then left with? Because the clouds move off.
Right.
And we're left with the pinpoint, icy light of stars. So this is cold light.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah. Just to point out one thing too, I love the idea that you've established of a wave-like progression here, right? So you did have a bit of with the word heaves there, a little bit of dialing up, but then kind of dialing back a little bit again in the next line was scud. So in a wave-like motion, we are increasing this. There are some interesting, Malazan connections here as well. Of course, when you're talking about darkness, you're going to think Tice Andy, and you're talking about the shore, you're going to think of the shake, and of course they are very much related. So they're just to throw in that little Malazan context there, but absolutely right about how we have eliminated the sun, we've sheathed the moon, the sickle-like moon, the weapon-like moon, giving us a premonition of the blood, which is why the red skirled foam. And then we have, as you said, the clouds also have been whipped to the side here. This is all in preparation for something big that's coming. And what you have left, as you said, is the stars, but it's dancing refuse of stars. An interesting choice of words, don't you think? Refuse, of course, we usually think of that of what's not just what's left over, but in the sense of there's a sense of chaos in there, I think, with the stars, a sort of a trembling that's going on here, as if the stars themselves are feeling what's coming, perhaps. But refuse being usually a negative connotation, right? Yeah,
the litter of stars across the sky. This is not a beautiful poetic sight.
Right.
This is, they've just been scattered willy-nilly. It's thrown away.
Yeah.
And but because it's coupled with dancing, again, that wonderful contrast that we get between the positive and the negative. Dancing is so beautiful. Dancing litter, the little dancing Coke can, it's it forces you kind of almost to pause at that, to parse it out. And because you get that pause, you find that's where we're getting into this almost like second stanza, because after salty midnight tides, you can almost imagine a full stop and a new stanza.
Well, there's capitalization. Yeah. And to finish the thought, the stars aren't just dancing up in the sky, they're dancing on the surface of the water, which is why they're dancing, right? On this host of salty midnight tides. That's where the stars are dancing. And you have the throwback allusion to the 5th book of the series, Midnight Tides, which has all kinds of connotations, doesn't it?
And then one last thing. So we've talked about sheathed moon, we talked about the red skirled foam, and now the salty tides. Now, obviously, quite literally, the sea being salty. No one has a problem with that. And then you think of the saltiness that's associated with blood.
Yeah.
The red foam. Is this the literal sea that we are seeing this, or is this a symbolic representation of a tide of blood about to sweep across the world?
Exactly. Yeah.
So
Nice. Yeah.
that's and I know people sometimes think that you've said this before. Poems are not you just it's one key for one lock to unlock a single meaning. This is
Exactly.
not what poetry is. It's about these metaphors, these symbols, these feelings that it evokes, and sometimes they're contradictory. Sometimes they play into a very straightforward reading or a very cohesive reading, and it's you try to find the points of connection that make it cohesive, and then you can look at other things and go, well, why is that in there? Why is that causing me to pause there, or to give you second thoughts, third thoughts, fifth thoughts
Yeah.
about something?
And then, as you said, we do begin another stanza. And I feel like the tension immediately is ratcheted up in the second stanza. The only indication being the capitalization of gather, right? Gather, drawn, and swell tight your tempest, lift like scaled heads from the blind depths. So again, that darkness down under the deeps here. We're going under the surface now for the first time, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this sense of something that is being gathered, getting ready to spring, to be unleashed, right? And it is in the air, but it's also down in the depths, down in the very depths under the waves. All your effulgent might in restless roving eyes. So that's an interesting choice of words. Again, effulgent is a kind of is bright, right? It is illuminating. So that's an interesting choice of words to contrast with all of the darkness that we've been seeing before this point, even though we have this blindness deep down in these depths with the absence of sun, absence of moonlight. It's interesting. And the scaled heads, again, there's a Malazan reference perhaps because of the Kachin Chamal who come into the shore and are birthed this way in connection with the sheikh, so very interesting stuff going on here. What do you make of those lines?
Well, one of the first things is again where I had gotten that sort of tidal imagery. Like we're building it up as we're going now, but gather, drawn, and swell tight. You can imagine. So we'd had that forward motion of all of this stuff, and then now this is the tide coming back and building. So that motion of the ocean.
The deep breath.
I get to work in all of these little things.
You're good that way. But it's the deep breath we're taking here.
The deep breath. It's the calm before the storm. It's where in all those disaster movies, when they go, oh, there's this thing happened, and then suddenly the sea gets drawn all the way out, and everyone goes, oh, that looks a bit strange, and you can see the fish flopping around on the sand, and then you see the giant tidal wave coming. That is the sense here. Gather, drawn, and swell tight your tempest. So that's the sense that I was getting. And then you pointed out that connection to the diegesis of the Malazan world about the scaled heads.
Yeah.
But for someone even not familiar with that,
yes,
what has scales? Fish. What lives in the ocean? Fish.
Yeah.
So we can have, even with that, without making that very direct reference, we can find that cold, in this case, Piscine reference rather than reptilian.
True.
But referring to fish from the blind depths. And you imagine those pale, pallid creatures coming up from the very darkest parts of the ocean that have the weird and wonderful bioluminescence attached to them and the strange, monstrous jaws, because they look so different from what we are used to.
Yeah.
And the might in the restless, roving eyes. And now we get a sense almost of this violence, this pent-up violence, this power is being targeted, is looking for a target, is being focused toward. That adds to a lot of the menace of this, at least for me.
Yeah. Oh, definitely so. And then we get hit in this next, if it's a stanza, it begins with the capitalization of reel back. And now this is something's been hit. When you reel back, you've been hit by something hard. And it's the entire shoreline where the forests are bending backwards from the force of this gale that has hit. it's been unleashed, and during this night gale, and the black waves crash on the black shore. So again, we're blind in all of this, but we can sense all the violence nonetheless. I mean, it is just this huge force that is crashing against the land to steal the flesh from your bony roots. So I think, is that a reference back to the trees that are being undermined by the wind and the waves that are being eroded, or are these roots referring to the land itself? There are, I think, several possible connotations there. Perhaps we should stop there with those three lines and get your take on them.
Well, and certainly, reel back your tottering forests this night. The black waves crash on your black shore. Now, we've been talking a lot about the water imagery.
Yeah.
But if you can imagine, if this is an inky black night and you're suddenly hit with a force that you can't see, is it black water? Is it this black wave? Is it the wind itself? Is this the storm front coming through?
Right.
So we can talk about a storm front and the waves of a storm, as well as, so I know there's a temptation to get very tied into the water imagery, but there is this transition that we can make now, that we can see subtly, that a lot of these things are actually being applied to air, to wind in imagery as well. So just to bear that in mind. But the black waves crash on the black shore. So because it's the combination of waves and shore, that's what's making us think and commit to these are physical waves of water. And when we think of what happens, have you ever seen on a beach where there's been a very, very high tide, but it's violent, and you see the waves crash, and as it rakes back, it's ripping down the stones from the berm. All of the lightest material is being stripped away. The sand is being stripped away. And all that's left are the rocks underneath, the bare bones of the earth.
Yeah.
Any vegetation that is wrapped through that would have been buried under the sand and slight bits of sandy soil, that is ripped and torn away. And these bare tendrils are left dripping in the salt water as everything is torn away by this violent wave, this violent motion.
Yes. Good.
And the last thing kind of on this is stealing the flesh from your bony roots. So we talk about that literal thing that I just said, but think of it literally, stealing the flesh from your bones. That when caught in a windstorm, and people talk about being wind burned, or people being caught in a sandstorm and basically their flesh being burned or desiccated,
right?
All of these things, when the wind is that powerful, your flesh is peeled back, it's forced back, and you become skeletal.
Yes.
So again, that sense of violence, and because we are all leaning into this conclusion of the poem about death, about a reaper's gale, what is one of the most common images of death? The grim reaper with the skull and the hood. And here we have it. This is being evoked before we get to that point.
Yeah, which makes you think, I mean, the idea of flesh and bony roots, and of course bony calls to mind, as you said, the skeleton, the bones, and obviously death imagery here. But it makes you think that this could also be a metaphorical storm, that it doesn't necessarily have to be a natural storm. It could be an invasion. It could be some other form of apocalypse. It could be any number of violent actions that produce mass death and destruction. So, this whole thing could be a metaphor as well, just on that level. But the commonality here is death. And we know this is, whatever this is, it's going to end in some serious destruction. So, and as the next line says, death comes, shouldering aside in cold legion, in a marching wind, this dread, this blood, this reaper's gale. I love that ending, the repetition of this blank, this blank, this blank. It just, you sort of, you're almost forced to trip along as you read that, right? It carries you with it. But I love this ending too, because death comes, and the idea of cold legion. So it's like an army, right? Again, the military metaphor here. And it's cold because we think of death as being cold. The warmth is stolen from you. Death is seen as a cold thing. And this wind that is marching, again, the military connotation here to the word marching. And you have the dread because of what's coming, and again the blood, which we've talked about before with the red scurled foam and so on. It's a thread that's run through this whole thing. Again, of course, being linked very closely to the idea of death. And then this Reaper's Gale, and as you said in the very beginning, the Grim Reaper. This is a wind that belongs to death here. So really powerful stuff. What do you have to add to the last 3 lines?
I very little to add to that, except shouldering aside in cold legion. And one of the things I like is the double word play with the word shouldering. Nice. Because if you think legions marching side by side, shoulder to shoulder, this idea of cold legions, the legions of death, this army on the march, and we get that with shouldering as a way of describing how they are marching, but also shouldering aside as in this whole pushing people out of their way, trees being forced down, everything being destroyed in the path of this force that cannot be contained, that cannot be stopped, that is indomitable, that is going to perpetuate no matter what. Nothing will stop it. And that cold legion, the legions of death, the cold skeletons rising up out of the water, this army of the undead. And of course in Malazan, that's an undead army is not entirely without precedent.
No, indeed. Brilliance. I love it. Anything else?
So I just thought, now that we've finished that, if I stop sharing this, just a couple of closing thoughts. So I think like those are very persuasive ways to read this. The predominant imagery, the easy, most cohesive ways to approach this. But I think there's an interesting other way of looking at this, because we were looking at it all of these obvious things. What is the one force that inexorably takes us to death? Time, which we cannot see, we cannot stop, that trees fall from, boulders are destroyed by, landscapes are swept away by, because everything under time, which is invisible, it is the darkness. Time keeps marching. Time marches on. And I don't think that is the most persuasive reading of it, but I think it's this really nice secondary connotation that underlies all of it, because we focused on those big, the violent, the vibrant, the poetic, and then underlying all of it is actually something far scarier, far more subtle, far more insidious, and yet creates all of those effects, just not in a short space of time. It gets there eventually, which is a different feeling, but it is the Gale that comes for you.
It's interesting because I do think the human fascination and fear of the apocalyptic is very much rooted in our fear of our own individual mortality. I do think that there's an interesting connection there. So
individual mortality, aren't you an immortal like me?
Well, we're not. I'm not quite at that level of ascendancy there, AP. So, but yeah, I love that way of framing it. That's, I think, a very interesting and provocative and persuasive way of looking at the poem as something that pertains on a more individual level of fear of one's own mortality. And it does feel, because we're some of us are attached to ourselves, some more than others. Some have a slightly inflated sense of self-importance. But no, I mean, I think that's a very real, palpable fear that we experience for our existence, as brief as it is, and it feels apocalyptic from our little tiny perspective, because when we're gone, our world is gone. But but yeah, so I do think there's a link there that
Yeah.
is.
I think you're exactly right. Our fear and obsession with apocalypse, our fear and obsession with cataclysm, um, is rooted in that individual trepidation about death, the fear of our own mortality, the fear of the unknown, the fear of what's going to happen. And because of that, this actually goes to another point that we have. Quite often, our own personal things, we universalize, we expand out our personal worldview, we universalize, go, that's how everyone else thinks. And there are certain things like this, I think, that most of us do fear, even if we're not always aware of it, even if we're not consciously going, I'm going to die today and I'm really worried about it. But it's part of the human condition. It's part of mortality that underlying. There's sometimes an uneasiness, particularly as you and I have aged a little tiny bit more than some of the people watching this. That as you age, you realize you're getting closer and closer to that departure lounge for the final flight.
Yeah.
And there's nothing you can do to recapture your youth. No matter what anyone tells you or tries to sell you, you cannot recapture that time.
Yeah.
But there is how you spend your time.
Yep.
And I am very glad that I got to spend this time with you, my friend.
Likewise, I was going to say exactly the same things, that this was time that I will treasure always. And I thank you, my friend, and I invite our viewers to contribute to the discussion in the comments below, and we look forward to reading those. So thank you very much for everyone, and thank you, AP.
Thank you very much, Philip.